Welcome to Physician-Assisted Suicide, Should We or Shouldn't We, with guest speaker Dr. Paul Chamberlain. My name is Jared White, and I am the Director of Education and Development for Abbotsford Right to Life. And this is one of the main passions of ours, is educating people and bringing together forums where we can have honest discussions and open dialogues about some of the more contentious issues in our culture. One of such issues is the issue of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Dr. Paul Chamberlain will probably talk about some of the nuances there. What to say about Dr. Paul Chamberlain? He has been publishing books on ethical issues for over 15 years. And he is a doctor, Dr. Paul Chamberlain, and I had him as a professor at the Northwest Seminary, which is at ACTS, for about 4 years. And I've taken several courses with him, and he's an incredibly intelligent, bright man, and he has a really gifted insight into the issue of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And it's really something that we need to really think deeply about as a culture. Most of the people I know, my friends and family, they're completely for assisted suicide. They don't see what the big deal is. And there may be many of you here today too that don't see what the big deal is. But whatever your view is, I hope you keep an open mind tonight, and as we listen to everything that Paul Chamberlain has to say, and then afterwards there will be a chance for some dialogue, so we can not just hear what Paul has to say, but we can all have our own say together tonight as well. So without further ado, as it is now 7:05, we'd like to give a warm round of applause for Dr. Paul Chamberlain.
We'd like to thank you very much for being here tonight. I really appreciate you all coming. I know there's lots of things to do on a, this is Monday, isn't it? On a Monday night.
And the big debate's on.
The debate's on. I know there's a baseball game going. Game 7 is tonight. There's a big debate on tonight. There's other things you could be doing other than being here, but I thank you for coming. I really do. And good to see you there, Dan. Dan and I run into each other about once every 8 months, 10 months somewhere, and we get to chat. I was going to say here, I'm up here speaking, but I have actually had the privilege of working with more than one of you in this room tonight on these issues, particularly Michael Horner. Michael and I were teaching ethics at Trinity at the same time, and both working on this exact issue at the very same time. I remember going into Mike's class to give one little guest lecture one day because he knew I had been preparing for some debates on the issue, and we discussed it a lot. We traveled together on it. So I just like to say, I hope this lecture tonight goes really well. If it goes really well, then I think Mike should share some of the credit for that, because he was involved in the preparation for it. However, if I bomb tonight, if things go really badly, I think Michael should shoulder his share of the blame for that as well, because he was all part of the preparation. So are you okay with that, Mike? Either way.
Sure.
Okay. So we'll call on Mike up here later on if we need to answer some of the finer questions. Mike and I did travel across the country a few years ago, and on this exact issue. Working on it with 6 different debates, and we learned a lot about the issue, had a lot of feedback. It was really, really great. I just want to commend Mike for what he's done in this issue over the years. I also want to commend the work of the Right to Life Committee. Jared, and I know I see Dorothy here, and others of you who have been working on these, on lots of issues like this tirelessly over the years. It's wonderful work you're doing. It often goes unnoticed, often goes unthanked, because people don't always know what's going on. But as I see it, you folks are looking out for our most vulnerable members of our society. People like the elderly, the terminally ill, the disabled, and probably the most vulnerable, the unborn. We often talk about other people being vulnerable, but nobody is quite as vulnerable as the unborn, because you can't even hear them, you can't even see them. And it's you folks who are really spending a lot of effort, a lot of issues, in some cases devoting your entire lives to looking out for those people. So I really appreciate that. I want to commend you for that, and thank you for the work that you do. And so we have this opportunity to playing a really small part in that tonight to address this one issue. And we're here addressing the issues of morality, but also legality. When it comes to this issue, it's morality and legality all put together. There's moral questions and there's public policy questions. They all come together. And as you probably know, this is an issue which is very divisive as well. It's one of those issues people say you probably should stay away from when you're in polite company, like religion, like politics. Stay away from this one as well, if you don't want to spoil things. It divides our society, also in the United States, much of the Western world. I mean, wherever you happen to go, you can probably count on people having different opinions on this issue, and I mean people who would probably agree on many other things. But when it comes to this issue, having differing opinions. It's interesting, isn't it? I'm not exactly sure why that is, except that we're looking at an issue that sometimes, in some ways, seems to bring together conflicting moral principles, and that's why it can tear away at you when you figure, well, should we go this way or should we go that way? So we're going to get into it tonight and try to look at some of the information with it, some of the details, and some of the arguments back and forth here. There's another thing. The word euthanasia. It's a pretty odd word, isn't it? I mean, when do you use a word like euthanasia? I mean, how many have wondered what this word even means, especially when you first heard it? I mean, we probably all heard the joke about the elderly gentleman who was asked what he thought about euthanasia, and you know what his answer was? He was much more concerned about the kids here. Pretty bad. But you know what? When you heard the word euthanasia, what did you think? What does it mean? Well, it's not about the euthanasia or anything like that. It literally, the word comes from two Greek words, and you put them together, it means literally good death. That's what it means, the two Greek words. And the idea is rooted in the hope that we can take some kind of steps to make the process of dying less painful and maybe better than it otherwise would have been for people who are suffering. That's what the word is, the idea of this word. That's what it's rooted in, and it's gone on from there to become this huge ethical question, this huge ethical issue. One thing I myself learned very early on in my own study, my own reflection of the issue, is that this issue is not a purely theoretical and academic question, and I'll bet you all know that here today as well. You don't have to be a scholar or interested in academic matters to be concerned about this issue. It's not that way. My own mother suffered with multiple sclerosis for 34 years. I watched her go from being a very vibrant, very active, very energetic person to the point where at the end of her life, for the last 4 or 5 years, she was lying on a bed, unable to speak, unable to eat, unable to show any recognition of us. Her body was increasingly crippled up until she eventually died. And she died at the age of 73 and had this for about 34 years. Got it when she was 39 years old. And over the years, as I watched her lay in that condition and getting increasingly worse, I was reminded repeatedly that it's conditions just exactly like this that cause some people to want to take control of the time and the circumstances of their death. Isn't that correct? That's the issue right there. And you know, I had to admit, it wasn't hard to see why. It really was not. I sometimes felt like my face was being rubbed right in the issue, and of course I was called upon to teach in the issue and to debate on it and to write on it a number of times. So I had to come to grips with both sides of this issue. And that's what I think we should maybe move into tonight. Let's set out first of all what I consider to be the fundamental question in this issue, and then we'll go on from there to looking at some of the issues around it and some of the arguments on it. When I say the fundamental question, I always say that no matter what ethical question you're talking about, we've got to learn how to reform the fundamental question of it. And the fundamental question has got to be one that people on all sides agree on. They at least agree this is the question. You see what I'm saying? So you have, whether it be in the abortion debate, where you take a strong pro-life person, a strong pro-choice person, and you might say, can those two people agree on anything at all? Well, they should be able to agree on at least this is the question that we disagree about. And if you can't agree on that, you can't go any further. You can't even discuss it, you can't analyze it, you certainly can't debate it, and you can't even probably think very clearly about it. And with this issue, we better do the same thing as well. So how about this for the framing the question? You can put that up there, James. The question is this, and this is agreed to. This one here agreed to by Sven Robinson, who debated very strongly in favor of legalizing this physician-assisted suicide, and I think it's a good question as well. Should a patient who decides his or her suffering is too great be given the right to request and receive a physician-assisted suicide? How about that? Should a patient who is going on suffering, who no longer wants to endure that suffering, should that person be given the right to request and receive a physician-assisted suicide? Now this is tricky business forming questions. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen those polls and surveys that they take on all kinds of social issues? And some people say, we did a survey and we got a 72% number in favor of this. Somebody else says, we did and we only got 45% in favor of it. They say, well, how did that work? It's surveyed the same group, same people. Well, sometimes you need to ask, what question did this group ask, and what question did this group ask? You get a different answer when you frame a question differently. And people will almost go to war over you getting the wording that they want for their question. I'm hoping this question sets up where we're going to go. So there's some people who are suffering. What if they say, my suffering's too great, I no longer want to endure that suffering? Should that person be given the legal right to request and receive a physician's assistance in any of their life? Now, I think there are, broadly speaking here, 3 positions on this issue. Let me look at them. I think there's one that's what I would consider to be an extreme view on one side. I think there's an extreme view on the other side. And I think there's a third option. I didn't invent this one, but I read it by others who worked in the area a number of years back, and as soon as I read it, I thought, this is a wiser approach. And that's the one I will advocate for later on. But let me first of all put the other 2 up here. The first one is this, what I call a first extreme view, and it's this, that we ought to use every medical means at our disposal to extend every life as long as we possibly can. How about that? We ought to use every medical means at our disposal to extend every human life as long as possible. The reason I say this is a mistaken view, is because given the technology we have today, this runs the risk of merely prolonging the dying process and probably increasing human suffering in the process, and using the medical profession to do so. And I would say this, we must recognize that it's not the job of medicine to keep people alive forever. It's not the job of medicine to prolong the dying process or any prolonged suffering. As a matter of fact, as one medical doctor up in Edmonton, Dr. Arnold Locke put it, we should realize that it's this very power of medicine which has been the driving force behind the euthanasia movement. People have become scared and nervous of what medical science might do to them when they're no longer able to call the shots for themselves. And so they want to take control of the time and circumstances of their death now. I would say this, the responding with human dignity and compassion means not prolonging the dying process, it means allowing people to refuse medical treatment if they will. So that's why I believe this particular viewpoint has gone too far. Now I have a lot of respect for people who hold it, because they do it out of a real respect for human life and the dignity of human life. But I do believe it's a mistaken view. Now just before I comment on the second one, the second and more extreme position on the other side, let me clarify something that I think has to be brought to bear here. And that is that when you talk about physician-assisted suicide, we're not talking about the right to refuse medical care. Follow me there? That is not physician-assisted suicide, the right to refuse medical treatment. That's not euthanasia, that's not physician-assisted suicide. As a matter of fact, that's already legal and available as it ought to be. And the reason I say this is because according to a much more sophisticated survey done a few years ago in Vancouver, 67% of those who claim to favor legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide, 67% of those ones were wrongly including in their definition this exact thing, the right to refuse medical care. That's what they thought euthanasia to be. And they said, yeah, we're in favor of that. Only 57% of those respondents even knew this was already legal and available. And that's where definitions of terms become very, very important. And that's also the trouble with polls and surveys. You don't always know what people are thinking of with the terms. So we're not talking about the right to refuse medical care. Rather, we're talking, you can go to the next one, son. We're talking about going the next step to that other extreme view, crossing what I consider to be a very important line, and having physicians use their awesome powers over life and death to actually terminate the lives of patients. Okay? Put that up there? Yeah, to intentionally end a patient's life. Now the word intentionally is very, very critical there, by the way, but to intentionally end a patient's life. Now, let me go to the next slide here, because we have a definition of physician-assisted suicide, and we'll have a couple of these I'll put up here. But notice what we have here by way of definition. A physician-assisted suicide occurs when a physician provides the means, or the method, or possibly both, to a person who requests assistance in dying. That's what a physician-assisted suicide is. When a physician provides the means, or the method, or both, to a person who requests assistance in dying. That's exactly what that is. Now let me go to the next slide, because there's another definition we have here. This one's from Alex Schattenberg. Some of you probably know who he is. But notice what he says there. He works with the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in Canada here. Euthanasia is an action or omission of an action done to directly and intentionally cause the death of another person, usually by medical means. Assisted suicide is when one person is directly and intentionally involved with causing the death of another person. And I think it's really important that we'll come to a little bit more on this a bit later on. What's the next slide, son? I'm forgetting what the next slide is. I just want to see. Okay, we'll be there in just a second. I want to really make sure we really understand here that assisted suicide and euthanasia take place when somebody carries out some action with the intention of bringing about the end of that other person's life. The intention has to be there. If the intention's not there, then we don't have an assisted suicide or euthanasia. Let me go to the third view, which I think avoids both of those wrong extremes. It's a much better middle ground, steers away from the one of terminating patients' lives or prolonging the dying process. And it's a middle ground which says this: we need to use the medical profession to try to heal when we can. You follow that? To heal when we can. But when that's no longer possible, or when the patient requests we quit trying, then what do? Then we turn our attention to providing compassionate palliative care, which we already have at our disposal. So we do everything we can to reduce suffering, to increase comfort, to deal with the emotional, psychological, spiritual needs, and make the journey with the dying person through the dying process. And we try to show them that even in that state, they're valuable, they're needed, they're wanted, and they'll be missed. I remember Dr. Will Johnston, who some of you probably know, Vancouver physician, great guy, and works on this issue a lot. I heard him on the radio with Rafe Mayer one day, and Rafe was asking him, what do we do then? What do we tell people to do if they have grandparents or parents who are aging and they're in those nursing homes, and some of them wonder, why should I go on living? And Will Johnston's answer was, go visit them. Tell them when they're gone, you're going to miss them, and make them believe it. And I remember being on a program myself in Atlanta, Georgia, talking about this exact issue one day, and it got all done, or no, it actually went to a commercial break. And the young man was interviewing me. He told me this little story right in the break. He said, you know, my grandmother is in a nursing home right now, and it says she's a very a wonderful Christian woman, and she'd just be very happy to die. And I go see her all the time, and she's a really great lady. And so she says to me, why does God leave me here? He says, and I tell her, because I'm going to really miss you when you're gone. He leaves you here because I need you. I said, you know, that is the best answer you could possibly give to your grandmother. And that's exactly what Will Johnston said. And that's what this third way is all about. Use the medical profession. Can we heal? Can we bring about cure and vitality and anything that can be done, anything positive? Yes. Well, then we should do it. But when that's no longer possible, when the person is at the end of life, or when they say, you know what, I don't want us to try anything more with medicine, I've had enough, then we simply turn our attention to providing compassionate palliative care. And we walk through the dying process with that person. I have this little story that I've had for a number of years from the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute, really a great story about an intern working in the hospital. And it seems to me to illustrate this third way. She says there was a patient there, a woman in her late 40s. She had abused her body badly with drugs and alcohol. Now she was bedridden. She was sweating profusely. She was dependent upon a machine for breathing. She had tuberculosis. She was dying. This was in Toronto. The drugs were no longer working. There were no more therapies to offer. Nothing could be done. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Breathing was assisted. She would not live more than a few days. In the final days, this intern says, I learned a lot about bioethics and the gift that we can bring to the discipline there. She says, the patient and the staff members wanted to know whether it would be permissible to disconnect the respirator when the outcome would be death. So we turned to the Declaration on Euthanasia for guidance. And we found out there, it gave us unequivocal guidance, prohibiting assisted suicide, euthanasia on one hand, but providing a balanced consideration of dilemmas faced at the end of life. And it said this: while life is to be valued, we do not insist that the life of a dying patient be prolonged at all costs. When treatment is deemed to be extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome, or overly burdensome, and when death is imminent, treatment may be discontinued, provided that the patient continues to receive care. Although that's 5 different things that are included there. She says, in the ICU, the latest advances in technology save lives that would otherwise be lost. But we must keep in mind and we must keep our priorities straight. Technology is always to be in our service. It is not to dominate us, and we are not to make idols of it. So my colleague and I prayed about this case. The patient knowing she would not be abandoned, decided that death was near. She wanted to be free of the burdens and tubes and machinery as she died. A respiratory technologist disconnected the machinery, while a nurse took a seat next to the patient. Over the next few hours, the patient's condition worsened. She was drenched in sweat. The nurse never left her. She wiped the patient's forehead, kept her mouth moist. She brought in a radio so the patient could listen to country music, her favorite. Must have been from Calgary. And she held her hand. When the patient died, a colleague who had also cared for her came in, and they wept. And I was just thinking, you know what? That's a case of bringing clear and informed thinking, undergirded by Christian compassion, right to where it was needed. And the question is, can we do that? Can we find ways of doing exactly that? Well, I think this third way at least points us in the right direction. Now, I would like to say at this point, if that's the case, if this third way is available, why are there some people who favor legalizing physician-assisted suicide? Well, today let me just give you 4 reasons that are very commonly given. And Michael Horner could give these 4 just as easily as I could, and a couple of others of you could as well. Let me just give them out. I'll comment on them very quickly, and then we'll switch it around and say, are there some other arguments or reasons why we ought not to legalize? But what are some 4 common reasons for legalizing assisted suicide that people would normally give? Because many people do. The first one is this. It has to do with what we'll call the humane treatment of animals. You can keep on going. Flip through the slides there, son. We should be getting to one here. Yeah, okay. Humane treatment of animals. What are we getting at with this one here? Well, the argument is actually made quite commonly. Look at. Shouldn't we treat human beings who are suffering at least as well as we treat animals who are suffering? What do we do when we have an animal that really is suffering? What do? There comes a time when we put that animal out of its misery. We end the life of the animal. Why? Because we want to treat that animal, catch the word, humanely. Okay? Well, shouldn't we be treating human beings at least as humanely as we treat animals? That's the argument right there. And this argument is quite compelling to a lot of people. As I've thought about it, I realized right off the bat, this is an argument from analogy, of course. You're comparing 2 things which are similar, the treatment of animals here, and who are suffering, treatment of human beings who are suffering. And I should say arguments by analogy are very common in philosophy and ethics and really all of life. We do that all the time. The point of an argument from analogy is that when we're not sure what to do in one case, we find in other cases quite a bit like it, where we are sure what to do, and we transfer the information, or the wisdom, the insight from this one over to this one over here. And it happens quite commonly. But let's bear in mind that the first way to examine argument by analogy, the first question you have to ask is, are the 2 things being compared similar? And you can even go further. Are they relevantly similar? And you can even ask further on, are they similar at the relevant points for the purposes of comparison? That's how my philosophy professor put it to me way back when I was doing my studies. I thought this is really important because you see, any 2 things can be compared, can't they? Almost any 2 things have some things in common and some things that are different. The question we need to ask here, are suffering animals relevantly similar to suffering human beings in this case? That's what you have to ask. So that if this is the right thing to do with animals, does it automatically follow that the same kind of treatment should be carried out for human beings? That's the question right there. And I have come to the conclusion that the answer to that is no. Because there are a number of considerations with human beings that do not apply to animals. I remember talking with Will Johnson about this exact issue. And we talked about it back and forth, and I said to Will, what do you think when people come to you and they say, look, we should either do this for animals, why shouldn't we do it for human beings? Will Johnson said, let's just put it this way. Suppose the homicide division at the police station gets a call and said, there's been somebody killed at that house, the particular house in town, you need to get over there. So the police rush in there, there's a person on the couch, he's dead, and somebody else right there, and they said, how did this man die? Well, I killed him. Okay, let's go. Well, just a minute before you take me out, let me just say it. He asked me to do it. Okay, I killed him because he asked me to do it. Okay, Will Johnson asked this question: how are those detectives ever going to even begin that investigation? He killed him, supposedly. I mean, we know he killed him, but supposedly the person asked to die. And of course, if that was Will Johnson's point was, if this becomes legalized, then you know what we've handed to the lawyers in our country, not because lawyers are sleazy and are bad, but because they're smart and they're doing their job. we've handed them another entire defense. A defense that could be called as a "he asked me to do it" defense. And the trouble with a "he asked me to do it" defense is that the only person who could ever deny that he asked me to do it is now on the couch there dead. No one else could possibly deny it because no one else is there. Now, we may think we can cover that with safeguards and things like that, but that at least shows you there's considerations that do not apply to human beings but do apply to animals. And the other point to be made here is by having laws which prevent us doing the same things that human beings we do with animals, we may just prevent someone from helping another person make the worst mistake of their life. Because there's some time when people become suicidal and they say, "Could you help me die?" Well, if the whole thing's legalized, somebody may help them. But as we all know, some people are suicidal, and later on, if it doesn't succeed, or if they manage to get through it, later on they're thankful they did not commit suicide. And the two considerations, as I see, that do not apply across the board, from animals to human beings, is number one, that doesn't apply to animals. We give lawyers a "he asked me to do it" defense with human beings, which I think is a very unwise thing to do. And secondly, we prevent someone from helping another one make possibly the worst mistake of their life. Neither of those, it seems to me, apply in the case of animals. So that's what I'd say about that. But let's keep that in mind. This is a very common argument used a lot. Here's another one used a lot by philosophers called the moral equivalence argument. And the argument is this, that it says, look it, we've already talked about the idea that it's sometimes legitimate to allow someone who's suffering to shut off the machines and simply die. They don't want to be kept alive by machines and equipment anymore, whether it be a ventilator or a respirator. They say, "No, I'd like to die, simply shut the machine off and that should be okay." Well, the moral equivalence argument says, you know what, morally speaking, there's no real difference between doing that and giving somebody a lethal injection who is in the very same kind of situation. Now here you say, yeah, but that's killing. And the person will say, yeah, but killing only seems bad because most of the time when we think of killing, what are we thinking of? Somebody on the street somewhere who has evil intent, uses a gun, uses a knife. That's killing. But what if you could find it used in a very same situation where we simply flip the switch and allow the person to die? What if the only switch you have to flip is a lethal injection? Are they not then morally equivalent? And the argument is this. They are morally equivalent so long as the motives are the same in both cases, whether we flip the switch here or give the lethal injection. If the motives are the same, the intent is the same, and the result is the same. In that case, why are they not morally equivalent? Which means if this one's okay, then that one should be okay in the very same kind of situation. If this one's bad, then that one should be bad. Are they not the same, since the motives and the intent and the result are the same? And people argue this at length. There's a philosopher named James Rachels who's made a big point of arguing this exact thing. Well, there's different responses to it. Let me give you one. The first response is, you know what? They're not actually as morally equivalent as you might think. There's actually some things that are quite different. When you simply stop the respirator, when you shut the respirator off so the person dies, what is it that kills the patient? Is it you, or is it the disease or condition they had? It's the disease, the condition, that's what kills. All we're doing is simply determining at that point that there's nothing more we can do to bring healing. The patient is dying anyway. The respirator is simply prolonging the dying process, so we're going to shut it off because there's nothing more we can do, and the person dies of the disease or condition they have. When you give a lethal injection, who is doing the killing then? We are. It's not the condition that kills the person, it's we as human beings kill a person who would otherwise not die. So they're not exactly the same right off the bat. But there's more. What about the motives and intent? Are they the same when you flip the switch here and give the lethal injection over here? Well, when you stop the respirator, again, let me ask, what are you trying to do? It seems to me you're only doing this. You're stopping, you're ceasing trying to keep the person alive. You're allowing whatever happens to happen, simply deciding the role of medical science is over, can do nothing more than increase suffering, prolong the dying process. That's not the purpose of medicine. So let's stop trying to keep the person alive, and if the person dies, they die. That's what we do over here. What do you do over here? You give a lethal injection. Am I right in saying you are intending, you are trying to end the life of a person? Because imagine if you do that and the person does not die, then what? Over here the person does not die. Well, no harm done, you haven't done anything, you just shut the machines off and the person is still there. Over here, if you give the lethal injection and the person does not die, what do you call that? A botched suicide. And you got real trouble on your hands when that happens, because that has happened before. You did not succeed in doing what you tried to do, because it's botched. and we move into the position of being the ones who actually bring about the death of the person. I think it's a mistake to say the motives and the intent are the same. I don't think you can make that work. Let me go to the third one here. This may well be the most basic one of all. The third reason why people believe we should legalize assisted suicide, and that is personal autonomy requires that we give people this choice. In other words, there should be an individual choice given to people to make their big decisions themselves. To deny them this is said to be an affront to personal dignity. Some of you remember the name Sue Rodriguez quite a while ago now. She made this very famous statement after being turned down by the Canadian Supreme Court and her desire to have the law changed so she could end her life. And she said, "Gentlemen, if I cannot give consent to the time of my death, then whose body is this?" The point she was making is, it's my body. I should be the one to make this big decision about when I die. The time and the circumstances, anything else is an affront to my personal dignity. Individual autonomy requires it. Well, what do we say about that? This is, in my view, probably the most basic reason given. We've got a couple of responses here. The first response is this. I think we all know right off the bat that autonomy alone, in other words, the desire to give people personal autonomy alone, is never enough reason all by itself to change public policy. We always consider the effects on others. Is that not right? Is that not correct? In other words, many people want to do many things. Some are good, some are bad, and there's a whole range in between. But would anybody in this room or anywhere, and would anybody anywhere, seriously suggest we give complete liberty to anyone and everyone to perform any action at all, just so long as they want to perform it? Does anybody make any laws that way? I mean, that's ridiculous, really. Well, how about the reckless driver? How about the bank robber? How about the person who derives sexual pleasure from children? Do we just say they want to do it, therefore they should be given the freedom to do it? Never. That's not the way laws are made. And as a matter of fact, we have legal restrictions precisely to protect civil liberty and order. But sometimes we forget that every legal restriction we have, and we have many in this country, a lot of actually stack up to the ceiling here. Every legal restriction is a restriction on someone's choice. With every one, we're telling somebody they can't do something that they want to do. So when it comes to assisted suicide, we have the big question. What are the effects on others, on society, of us making this public policy change to legalize assisted suicide? And I think that to determine that, you know what we need to do? We must ask ourselves, who are the people who are mostly affected if we were to legalize it? And they're people who are the elderly, the terminally ill, and the disabled. They are immediately affected by this. And here is where I think people working in palliative care and with people with serious illness have a lot to teach us. Now, I remember when I was doing my initial research, I got in touch with some of these, and I got a whole earful from people who work in this area. I was told things like this: you need to put yourself in the shoes of our people, elderly people, terminally ill, people who are disabled, accident victims, whatever. Because here, just imagine, here you are. This has happened to you now. You're in the stress and trauma, facing a terminal illness, maybe a disability, maybe a paraplegia of some serious accident, and you're living with the fact that you are now a burden and an expense to others, family, loved ones, caregivers. If there's anything I learned from people who are in those situations, they feel very deeply what a burden they are to other people. Some of you probably know this. You know, they're no longer making the contribution they made before. They're dependent upon others for everything. They're not needed like they once were, and they struggle with issues of personal dignity and value. That is the life that they have, and that is just so clear to me. And the palliative care folks said, at that moment, to come to a person like that and say, you know what, you can exit the situation if you want. All you need to do is to sign here, or let us sign it for you, or follow whatever steps we have in place. But you can do that. To come to that person at that time, in that situation, struggling with issues of personal dignity and value, is to now place upon that person the added burden of having to justify their own continued existence. Because you see, now their own continued existence is a choice they've got to make, and a choice they can be called upon to justify. It never was that way before, but now it is, because you've given them that choice. And I repeat, it's at the time when they're feeling like they're a burden and an expense to others around them, no longer making a contribution. They're not needed like they once were. Here's how Dr. Arnold Voth put it. He says, that person can now be asked why, when others are choosing assisted suicide, others are giving up medical equipment, they're ending the burden and expense on others, some cases being made heroes for doing so, why you would like to live on. You can be asked that. And you can even be subject to pressure from others, subtle pressure from others to make that choice, whether or not you whether or not you want to be subject to that pressure. And just in case you think that's alarmist, let me move to the next slide. Jim, what do we have for the next slide here? Yeah, look at this slide here from a lawyer. Look what this lawyer, Janet at Buckingham, said. Said the elderly in our society are extremely vulnerable. As a lawyer, I can tell you that it is not unusual to have someone bring their aging parent into a lawyer's office to draft or redraft a will that is in the benefit of the son or daughter sitting beside them, coaching them as to the contents of the will. Sadly, there are many unscrupulous people who cannot wait to get their hands on their parents' estate. These are the same people that are making medical decisions for their parents. Get the picture? Now that's from a lawyer who's in that business, and I would just say, well, lest we think it's alarmist, this just means that now once it's legalized, just as in the case of abortion, a person can now be subject to pressure. Are there not young girls who are pregnant who are subject to pressure from parents, maybe from boyfriends, to have an abortion, which they would not be subject to if the thing was not legal? That's the same kind of pressure you could be subject to here. Let me read you a little quotation from Dr. Arnold Roth, the same one I mentioned earlier. He just says this: the infirm, the old, and the dying are very, very quick to ruminate on their own uselessness and the burden they are creating for others. They're also, he says, emotionally extremely vulnerable. Even the most subtle pressure from healthcare staff to opt for euthanasia might remove the patient's desire to go on living. And Dr. Peter Kine, another neuropsychiatrist who works in palliative care, told me this in a personal conversation. He said, I know for a fact that people who are dependent upon family and others almost universally feel grief and pain over the burden they are to their families. The sense of obligation, catch that word? Sense of obligation to exit the situation if it becomes a legal possibility will be overwhelming, and palliative care as an enterprise will fold its tents. And the point is that the present laws are there for the protection of people just like these, because at present these people know they'll be kept alive by default. No decision needs to be made, no discussion ever needs to be carried on. But once it's legalized, all that is changed. We at least have to be aware of that implication when we start talking about changing the law. Autonomy is never enough all by itself. You have to ask how a change in law would affect other people. Let me go on to for a second reason, though, as to why I'm not persuaded by the personal autonomy argument. And I do just take a second on this, but let me just ask you this. Suppose someone came to you and said, look at personal autonomy. Shouldn't people be given the right to choose? Think about that now. If someone said that to you, what would you say? Here's what I would say. I would say, how far are you willing to take the argument from personal autonomy? Are you really willing to be consistent with that? What if a young, healthy, but emotionally depressed person wants to die? What if you meet a 16-year-old person who's had a really tough life, difficulty with parents, just broke up from their boyfriend, girlfriend, things are going really badly in school? That person wants to die. What about that person's autonomy? Is autonomy really adequate? And my point is, if you honor the personal autonomy of the elderly, terminally ill, and the disabled person, but you do not honor the personal autonomy of the young, able-bodied person, well then what do we got going here? We have a subtle form of discrimination. We're making value judgments about which lives are worth fighting for. So we're not really basing our decision on the personal autonomy. We seem to be using the argument to push for it in some cases, but when we think a person has, here's the wording I've heard, too much to live for, or should not receive assisted suicide, we quickly override it. I would just ask you, how serious, or how consistent are we really willing to be if we want to go with personal autonomy? I'll bet that most of the people who advance personal autonomy would put their own limitations on right at the point where they beat up some lives that they do not think should have it, which means personal autonomy is not being applied consistently at all. Let me go to a fourth one, and that is this, that people will do it anyway. Have you heard this argument? We should legalize it because people will do it anyway. It's a little bit like, what's that other argument for abortion? Just a bit like this. Have you heard the argument for abortion that goes like this? Argument is, what's it often called? There are, what kind of abortions often happening? Back alley abortions, exactly right. Women will be harmed. Women will be hurt if we don't legalize this, because it's going to go on. They're going to get it done anyway. So if you have laws that do not permit abortion, you have an anti-women policy going on because women will be hurt. Well, the same kind of argument is made here. People will do this anyway. It's been made by a number of people, but one person who I know who's made it quite passionately, his name is Russell Ogden. You probably heard him on the radio recently if you've been following this issue at all. But he's a guy who was an SFU student a number of years back, And he did a whole lot of research on this exact issue. He went into the AIDS community, and he found a lot of people who were suffering from AIDS. And he did research with these folks, promised them that whatever they told him, he would burn his research, and so they would never have to be responsible to the authorities for this, because what they were doing was illegal. In the community that he looked, he found people helping friends die, who were suffering terribly. They couldn't get assisted suicides legally, so they were helping each other die. And they were using plastic bags, they were using pillowcases, some of them were botched. He said, because when I read some of the stuff, I mean, it was horrible reading. And the rest of Ogden said, look, it's going on anyway. Whether it's legal or not, it's going on. Shouldn't we legalize it so we can bring it into the open and regulate it and make it more humane? We need to have policies which are realistic here, is what he said. It's going on anyway, why should we not do it? Well, I thought quite a lot about that, and I thought, is that argument persuasive or is it not? What do we do with that? Well, I remember reading a newspaper story once, a number of years back now, about a shop owner arriving at a shop maybe a little bit like this. He got to work in the morning, he was the only one there, he opened up the shop, was working through getting things ready for the day, and suddenly he heard some noise up in one of the heating ducts. It sounded like somebody was up there moaning. And he went, what is going on here? And he listened carefully and thought, yeah, there's somebody up there. There's somebody in there. Probably in a lot of trouble right about now. So he called the fire department. They came, and sure enough, they pulled our guy out of there. We tried to break into his shop during the night, through the heating ducts, but I guess they got a little smaller and smaller as they went. And he finally got to the point where he couldn't go any further in, but he couldn't back out either. And he was stuck there and almost dead by the time the fire department arrived in the morning. Now, to me, that would just about be hell on earth, being stuck in a spot like that where I couldn't move. I'm not sure if I could even do it. Even thinking about it makes me cringe. And this poor guy was up there. Well, I began thinking about that. Here he was attempting to break and enter the shop. He was harmed in the process, just about killed himself. I began asking the question, we need to think about a principle at stake here that's going on here. The fact that somebody violates a law and is harmed in the process, is that enough reason in and of itself to make an activity legal? That's the question you've got to ask. Because if it is, then you need to ask, well, what about other break-in enters? What about not just that one, but other ones? What about bank robberies? What about car thefts? People are sometimes harmed while trying to do these things. They're illegal now, because we have reason for making them illegal, but does the fact that somebody is harmed in the process, is that a good enough reason in and of itself to make that thing legal? Well, I think we all know right off the bat, that's not nearly good enough reason. We have to have much more reason than just that. And on the other hand, I would just say if something should be legal and permissible, you shouldn't need this argument to tell us that. You shouldn't have to wait for somebody to get harmed doing it to say, yeah, that's a good reason why we should make that legal. It should have been made legal anyway. So I would just say that argument, while it seems to have some merit in face value, it invokes a principle which we would never be willing to apply consistently. And that's the problem I have with it. But we can discuss these later if you want. Let me go to reasons against legalizing. I just want to put 4 on the table real quickly here. Some of them are a little bit repeating some of the same concepts we've talked about, so we don't need to go into great detail here. But what are some of the main reasons for not legalizing assisted suicide? Well, the first one is so basic, it hardly needs to be said, but it's just this. Killing is wrong. And why is it wrong? Because human life has value and has dignity. This fundamental idea of the dignity and the value of human life is reflected in our laws, in our country, and around the Western world, and even around the world in general. It's reflected in moral codes around the world. It's reflected in our consciences. It's there. It's reflected in biblical passages. Genesis chapter 1, human beings made in the image of God, and therefore have inherent value and dignity. And you know what? That's the fundamental idea. Human beings have value and dignity, therefore killing is wrong. Now, there's a few exceptions to this rule that we sometimes talk about. Capital punishment is an exception in some places. Self-defense is an exception. Going to war is an exception. But notice with all these exceptions, are they not all disputed hotly? And why are they disputed? And they probably should be disputed. Because they're all exceptions to a very, very basic rule, which is that the killing is wrong because human life has great value and dignity. And the only reason people would ever think we should allow any one of these exceptions, capital punishment, self-defense, and going to war, is because they see them as the only way to maybe save even more lives, to bring about some greater good, or prevent even some greater evil, or some greater injustice. So the question you have to ask is this: what overpowering reason is there for this particular exception, to legalizing assisted suicide, because it would be an exception to the rule? Now physicians will be using their awesome powers over life and death to intentionally bring to end the life of a patient. What is the overpowering reason? Especially when there are other alternatives available. Palliative care, there's other things that people can mention as well by way of alternatives. That's the first reason. Again, it's a foundational one. It seems to me you've got to get past this one somewhere if you're going to legalize this. And you've got to somehow argue, yes, this is an exception, and here's the overpowering reason for the exception. And you've got to tell what that is. Let me go to a second reason here against legalizing, and that is this. A slippery slope in this case is very difficult to contain. Slippery slopes are, they're an argument that, at least in the area of philosophy, where I have my training in, a lot of people don't like slippery slope arguments. And I admit they can be abused big time. They really can. But there's different kinds of slippery slope arguments. And the kind that's, there's one kind that says, it's not just that when you perform action 1, we'll get desensitized, and that will maybe lead us to more easily perform action 2, and then we'll be desensitized, and it'll maybe more easily perform action 3. Those kind are a little bit, as far as I'm concerned, a little bit less persuasive. But there's another kind of slippery slope argument that says that some actions are logically connected to other actions, so that if you allow this one, the logic of it will compel you to move to the next one. And the logic of that may compel you to move to another one. That's the kind I'm thinking about here, and I don't think these are anything to sneeze at. I think these are very serious. And I think that's the kind we may have at work here with this issue, and that's why I say a slippery slope may be very difficult to contain. Let me talk quickly about one case that happened in Holland a number of years back. There was a 50-year-old woman in Holland who was physically healthy, but very seriously depressed. She had had a terrible life. Her husband had abused her all of her life. She had 2 sons. They were both killed. One was killed accidentally. One committed suicide. She was having things had gone very poorly for her. She went to see her physician, her psychiatrist, whose name is Dr. Abodwin Chabot. This is all written up by Herbert Hendon in a book he wrote, and who wrote on this issue. And she asked her physician for an assistant. Can you help me have a physician assistant? Can you assist me? I want to end my life. And he said, you know what? This was in Holland at the time, and it was not legal to do it for that reason. You could have an assisted suicide, but not for what's called psychological pain, not psychological torment. You had to have physical pain. Okay? And the doctor said, I can't do this. And she came back repeatedly and asked him and asked him and asked him. Finally, he said, okay. And he gave her medication. She took it home, and she ended her life. And of course, the doctor then had to go on trial in Holland. And he got a lawyer, and the lawyer argued on the principle of personal autonomy, exactly as the law was in Holland. He said, look, we already have a law that says the person who no longer wants to endure their pain should be given that right to request and to receive a physician-assisted suicide. I know the pain intended is physical pain, but why should it be limited to physical pain? If it's pain, and psychological pain is sometimes worse than physical pain. Physical pain, we can do things about. We have all kinds of pain management. What pain management is there for psychological pain? Isn't psychological pain the kind of pain that leads people to suicide fairly regularly? And the court bought that. The court accepted and said, yeah, we already said this principle already allows for assisted suicide for pain. Why, on what basis can we possibly limit it to physical pain and not psychological pain? And he was acquitted, and the law was changed in Holland just like that. So now the psychological pain was now also regarded as a criteria by which, if you follow that, assisted suicide could be available. And you have to ask yourself the question, what safeguards are we going to put in place that we're really going to hold the line on? What if we say, well, if you're going to get this, you've got to have a written request. You need to write out your request. Well, that'll be the first one to go, because often people in these conditions cannot write for themselves. So that one will be the first to be struck down. I can pretty well guarantee that. What if we say, well, it's got to be physical suffering. That's our safeguard. That's where we draw the line. Why? Why physical? If it's suffering, why do we limit it to physical? So, as we just said, psychological is at least as bad as physical. What if we say the person has to be in a dying phase? It can't be before that. Well, why? If you're suffering, you may have serious suffering going on before you get to the dying phase. Why, on what basis are you going to limit it there? And it goes on, what about a young, healthy, but depressed person? Well, no one intends it for a young, healthy, but depressed person, but you have to ask, how do you stop it if autonomy is the driving force? If it's a criterion, how do you stop it from a young, healthy, but depressed person if that same lawyer goes to court and argues on the basis of autonomy? How do you stop it? Really interesting little statement here by his name is Dick Sobsey, who works up in Edmonton, and he writes a little bit on these issues. He said, he compares it here. He said, you know what? In my mind, he said, it's impossible to devise adequate safeguards. Here in Canada, look at the comparison. The primary reason for eliminating the death penalty was the recognition that in spite of all the checks and balances, in other words safeguards, that could be devised, there would be inevitable errors and abuses would wrongfully end lives. And that's true, isn't it? That's happened. So we ended it, and that's one of the powerful reasons why we ended it. The safeguards proposed for assisted suicide are far less rigorous than those applied in the justice system for crimes. So mistakes can be expected to be more frequent. And he asks this question, why should the lives of people with chronic illness or disability have less protection than the lives of people accused of a crime? And I remember when Michael Horner and I were doing these debates with Dr. Faye Gersh. She was the head of the Hemlock Society out of Denver, Colorado. We had 6 of these across the country. And the issue of the slippery slope would come up. And she would kind of downplay the notion of the slippery slope. So one day I decided we need to ask her up front, can you, if this is legalized, can you give us any assurance that you think a slippery slope will not occur? That we will not move on to other practices that we no longer have in mind now. Can you give us any assurance that will not happen? And her answer really amazed me. She said, a slippery slope is neither predictable nor preventable. Her answer herself. I thought, there's my quote right there. I was looking for a quote. Perfectly stated too, perfect grammar and everything. It's all right there, and that came from her. And I think that's a very serious matter, because if a slippery slope is difficult to contain, then you need to know that when you start down the road, even those on pretty much all sides are admitting that it may be very difficult to stop. A very good lesson in this, and one of my students did this one day, is to simply compare Canada's own history with the abortion question. Listen to the speeches by John Turner, the Minister of Justice in the House of Commons, when abortion was being debated back in 1969, 70, 71. Listen to those speeches, and then follow the history of what happened. It is incredible. It was meant to be a very small procedure for a very minor, a small number of people with very strict requirements, and he had them all listed out there as to what they would be. In no time at all, it was impossible to maintain. And hold those. And I would just say, in this case, the slippery slope is very difficult to contain as well. Let me go to number 3 here, and that is this. We already talked about this third reason against legalizing, and that is it involves a discriminatory value judgment against very vulnerable people. I've already talked about this before, but I remember being on this panel. It was Dr. Rob Pankratz and me, 2 of us. He used to be the head of the Canadian Physicians for Life, with Russell Ogden, he was the guy, we mentioned him earlier, and another medical doctor. And we were from representing assisted suicide position. 4 of us were on this television program. And they were very, and Russell Ogden looked at me at one point, he said this, I just have a question for you, he said to me. He said, if you meet someone and they say, I would like to end my life, I'm suffering, I'd like to end my life, do you think you have a right to force them to go on? That was his question to me. It's a pretty interesting question. And I actually admired it for coming out that direct and asking me that question. And I said, well, Russell, I just had to ask you this, and my answer. Suppose that person was 16 years old. Do you think you have a right to, and they were perfectly healthy, but emotionally depressed, do you think you have a right to force them to go on? And he got kind of irate. He said, I'm not talking about people like that. And he was a youth worker. He worked with young people. And the other doctor said, we're talking about older people who are in their 80s and 90 years old. That's what we're talking about. I said, but the principle of autonomy is this. If a person makes a choice and they no longer want to endure the suffering, they should be given the right because they would like that right. Are you willing to do it for these people? And the answer is no, it would not. And Russell Ogden's answer to me was, these young people have, because I said, well, why not? He said, because these people have too much to live for. Now, my answer, my point is just this. Just analyze that. I believe in autonomy, but only for people who I've decided do not have as much to live for. And so their autonomy should be honored. The autonomy of the people who I decide have too much to live for should not be honored. That's not really autonomy. That's looking for a way to allow these people to die, but not these ones over here. And I would just say, in the process, we've made this value judgment about which lives we believe are worth fighting for and which ones are not. That's what it comes down to. And to me, it's one of the worst forms of discrimination that we're ever going to get in the country. And that's what I think it will end up involving. The fourth one is just this, my fourth reason, I've already talked about it. But I would think this is one of the most powerful reasons against legalizing, and that is that legalizing what imposes a devastating burden upon the most vulnerable people of our society. And I think if there's anything to proclaim loud and clear again and again and again, is that the strongest reason for not legalizing is because we take people who are already elderly, terminally ill, disabled, and maybe accident victims, whatever, at their worst, weakest, most vulnerable time in life. We place upon them the burden of now having to continue to justify their own continued existence, if not to others, at least to themselves. And that's at a time when they themselves feel the most vulnerable. Well, look, a lot more could be said on this issue. If anything's true, it's not. It is that this issue is not theoretical only. It's not only an academic issue. It involves real suffering, real people, real choices about human life. None of us has the option, I think, of being unconcerned about something like that, which is why I really appreciate you folks being here, missing that Game 7, missing that debate down there that's going on, and because you're showing interest in these issues, and I really appreciate it. You've been a very attentive audience too, by the way. So thank you for your desire to speak into it and to learn more, and I'd be happy to have any comments or questions or anything anybody would like to have. Jared's going to come up here and lead this part.